In the 1930s, dictators and militaristic regimes rose to power in Europe and Asia. American leaders were convinced that the United States would be drawn into the war. This led Congress to authorize the construction of 12 new naval bases. The largest base was built at Corpus Christi, Texas. It was designed to train Navy pilots. It opened in 1941, just before America entered the Second World War. Hundreds of young men arrived every week. They received rigorous training to prepare them for war. They received classroom training and physical training. They flew seaplanes called PBYs and training planes like the N3N and SNJ. By 1942, NAS Corpus Christi was the largest naval air station in the world. Over 30,000 pilots were trained here during the war. Half the American aviators who flew in the Pacific earned their wings at Corpus Christi. During the Second World War, NAS Corpus Christi was known as the University of the Air. Wayne Lundquist was a young man from Oregon when World War II started. The Navy sent him to Naval Air Station Corpus Christi.
I'd never heard of Corpus Christi before I got in the Navy. It wasn't quite as big as it is now.
Sand holes and ditches and rattlesnakes. There was no pavement, no roads. There was nothing out here at all. It was just sand dunes until they started building the base.
Not everyone agreed. The ranchers and fishermen who lived in the small fishing village called Flower Bluff didn't want the Navy taking their land. One thing was certain. The wide open spaces of South Texas were perfect for an air training facility.
It was probably the safest student training area in the United States is here in South Texas. It may not be the most scenic, but for the flat land, low foliage, low trees, nothing but scrub brush, it's probably the safest place to train student pilots.
The year-round flying weather was another reason Corpus Christi was chosen as the site for the base. South Texas also had an abundance of cheap fuel. The proximity of Mexico was also a factor in Corpus Christi being chosen. There was some concern at the time that the Nazis might attack through Mexico. Politics was also a factor.
You had a lot of Texans in Washington. In fact, that's the year that Lyndon Johnson ran for the Senate. You had Tom Connolly, senator, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Despite the protest of the local ranchers and fishermen, the Navy proceeded with its plans. 2,000 acres were purchased in Flower Bluff. Work began in June 1940 and proceeded rapidly. The Navy spent $100 million on construction. The base opened in March 1941, but work continued at a frantic pace even after the base opened.
There was still a lot of construction going on, right? They had bulldozers running around pushing up sand and everything, and somebody made the remark, the only place in the world that could be raining on you and sand blowing in your face at the same time.
The first cadets had a bigger problem than blowing sand. There were no airplanes. The cadets spent their time marching or in ground school.
I remember when the first plane came, it was the Stearman, of course, the Yellow Peril as they popularly call it, and it flew in one morning when we were at ground school, and everybody just quit ground school, ran out and shouted with joy because we were finally going to get to fly, and that's what we were there for, and that's what we wanted to do.
The base was officially dedicated on March 12, 1941. Lyndon Johnson was there. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox spoke. One of the first officers at the base was George Dorsey Price. His daughter was a young girl named Dorsey.
On the Sunday that Pearl Harbor was bombed, I was in the living room here, and my father was reading me the comics. And I began to cry because the announcer was hysterical.
Everybody was calling and wanting to know how soon they were going to be shipped out and when and how many. And is so-and-so on duty now? Is my son on duty? Is he going? And because no one had any idea that anything like that. That was
handle those calls?
With both hands, and we would have used our feet if we could have gotten them up there.
People all across the country were unified by the bombing of Pearl Harbor. President George Bush was a 17-year-old student at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts.
I remember walking across the campus with a friend of mine, George Warren, and we heard of it. Somebody had heard it on the radio. My reaction was one of horror, shock, but then there was an instant feeling of surge of patriotism in the whole country, and I think I felt that the minute I heard it. I was 17 years old, about to turn 18, and I think my reaction was the same as every other American's. We got to do something about this one.
Lieutenant Robert Kermsey was half a world away at that time.
In fact, I was flying between Yakutat, Alaska and Kodiak, Alaska, the day of Pearl Harbor. I flew many missions in the Aleutians, searching for the Japanese carriers and so on that had been bombing Dutch Harbor and our other installations. And finally, I was sent out of Alaska back to Kodiak and then to Corpus Christi. And because of my work in the Aleutians, I received a Distinguished Flying Cross, which was presented to me here in Corpus Christi at the Naval Station by Admiral Montgomery. I being the very first officer ever decorated on the naval base here. That.
It's quite an honor.
Yeah, it was at that time, yeah.
Marjorie Dewey was in Wisconsin at the time of Pearl Harbor. She saw an ad which offered jobs to female pilots.
I had been teaching school, and I liked it all right, but when I heard this ad that they wanted 25 women private pilots, now, back then, there may not have been more than 25, because I answered the ad and I got a telegram immediately. Report within 1 week to Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi. When I got here, I found out it was to instruct and link trainers, which were to teach instrument flying to the young pilots.
Bob Kermsey and Marjorie Dewey met in Corpus Christi and were married 6 weeks later.
Well, we had a rather stormy 6 weeks, so 6 weeks and 2 days we got married.
He invited me to go up to San Antonio with him because he had an aunt and uncle. We got up there and nobody answered the phone, and I thought, well, boy, this is really just a ploy. But it turned out he really had an aunt and uncle.
You continued your work here at the base even after you got married?
For a while, not too long. He decided that he didn't want me to teach much longer.
Well, there's another situation in there, too. Margie was married previously to an Army pilot who was killed immediately in the Aleutians. And after his death, in fact, 12 days after she heard that he had been killed, she had a baby. So when we married, I got two for the price of one.
Like the Kermseys, people from all over the country came to Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. Flight classes graduated twice a week during peak periods. At first, the Navy took individual photos of the graduates, but as the number of graduates grew, the Navy was forced to only take pictures of the entire class. President George Bush was a graduate.
But I determined early on, somewhere after Pearl Harbor, but before graduation, that I wanted to be a Navy pilot and that I wanted to go right away. And my dad didn't really object. He gave me a little counsel in the beginning, but when he saw my mind was made up, he did nothing but encourage me. And indeed, I'll never forget when he took me to the Pennsylvania station to see his little boy off to the wars in August, actually, of 42.
John Glenn was another graduate. During his distinguished career as a Navy pilot, he became an astronaut and the first American in space. He would go on to be a United States Senator. Game show host Bob Barker also earned his wings at NAS Corpus Christi. Training was rigorous for all cadets. The pace grew more and more hectic through 1942 and into 1943.
You would fly 7 days a week, either a morning wing or an afternoon wing. If you flew in the morning, then you're off in the afternoon. Come a weekend, if you flew Saturday morning, you had Saturday afternoon off and Sunday morning. And then you flew Sunday afternoon, but you flew 7 days a week.
After all, they were pushing students as fast as they could, and they didn't have enough of them. So we worked, you might say, straight through. Along with this flight training, there was an awful lot of marching. We marched everywhere we went. I'll tell you without reservations. We all wore these regulation black shoes, black slippers, and I used to wear a pair out every 3 weeks.
The training prepared the young cadets for all facets of war. Boxing matches were free-for-alls. Only one man would be left standing at the end of this match. In this training device called a Dilbert dunker, cadets were strapped into a simulated cockpit. When they hit the water, the dunker turned them upside down. They had to get themselves out. They also had to practice getting into life rafts. A cadet adrift in the open sea could easily be overlooked by a rescue plane. The cadets had to practice signaling the rescue plane. Mostly the cadets flew. They ranged far and wide over South Texas. As the program grew, the Navy built 6 auxiliary fields and about 25 practice fields to support the main station. Pilots from Latin America and Europe trained at NAS Corpus Christi II, and the base assumed an international flavor. The favorite plane of the young cadets was probably the Stearman or N3N. It was more popularly known as the Yellow Peril.
We used to say that you could do everything but fry eggs in it, because we learned to do aerobatics, formation flying, all kinds of, it seemed dangerous things. But for youngsters 19, 20, 21 years old, it was very romantic to be able to fly. We could remember World War I in the movies that we saw and so forth, and you kind of pictured yourself as that World War I ace flying the biplane like they flew in those days. But it was a fun plane to fly, and we learned to do a lot of things. And that was how I think the Navy helped us to develop judgment.
I love the Stearman. It's my favorite airplane. It's a plane it's an open cockpit plane. You fly with needle ball and airspeed by the seat of your pants. That's what I call real flying. It's a good aerobatic plane, and it's a fun plane, and it can take a beating.
Another plane used for training was the PBY. It was a seaplane, and it had to be hauled onto shore. Many of the ramps still remain. For John Glenn, PBY training was a chance to gain twin-engine experience.
And I wanted to get into be a fighter pilot if I could. And the rumor was that the Marine Corps was getting P-38s, and that if you wanted to get P-38s in the Marine Corps and fly those fighters, that you needed to get some twin-engine time if you could. The only twin-engine airplane in which there was any training at Corpus Christi at that time was the old PBY Catalina, the seaplane, the high-wing seaplane. And so those of us that were going in the Marine Corps, a lot of us went over and volunteered for PBY training so we could get some twin-engine time.
A variety of military and civilian support personnel was required to keep the base going.
But we gave them a definite, thorough flight test shakedown before they were even, they were fine-tuned by us. They were very flyable and almost guaranteed.
Were you required to do flying yourself?
I went along on all trips that I could go on. Most of those had the multi-engine jobs had to have the generating systems balanced in flight.
Well, they were needing people real bad whenever I first read about it in the paper, and they had schools over on Agnes Street that would teach you different trades if you wanted to come out here, and if you passed, well, they'd hire you. And so I went through those schools and took sheet metal to begin with. Also, before it was over with, I took another course in general mechanics. And when I came out here, I came out as a sheet metal worker, and I was, like I said, Rosie the Riveter, I guess.
We had a camera, or projector, that projected pictures of airplanes on a screen. And the student had a mock-up machine gun. And both of these were connected. So he'd press a button, and the light would show where the bullets would land, if they were real bullets and if that was a real plane. And that was training in aerial gunnery. I did that for just a little while here, and then went to Beeville and Kingsville, where I did more real hands-on gunnery practice.
At that time, we had about 27, they had about 27 girls when I first came aboard. We had a manual switchboard at that time, and every call was answered by an operator. Every call in and out, or transferred, or long distance, or whatever, every bit of it.
Yes, we were living on base because, you know, we had to be there for breakfast, and it was impossible, you know, at breakfast at 5-something that morning. So we had to be living on the station.
And what were the accommodations like for you? And your
Very, very, very crude. It was a barracks types, a temporary barracks that was erected by Brown and Root, which was a construction company. And so we lived in one of those. It was about 40 of us.
Unlike the Army Air Force, the Navy did not train African American aviators. Most blacks were mess stewards. There were exceptions, however, like these black sailors of Division X. They were part of a ground and gunnery squadron at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station. Bill Brady was a diver. One of his jobs was to recover the bodies of young cadets who died in crashes.
We had more plane crashes, far more plane crashes than we did casualties. Because, as I say, these were smaller, slower planes. The people had a chance to bail out, and there weren't as many casualties. But there were casualties. And I kind of hesitate to say this, but for years after the war, I could never eat a crab.
I know of one good friend of mine that was killed in a mid-air collision out over Nueces Bay, and they never did find out exactly why that happened. And there were lots of accidents in primary, especially where the kids were not really well enough trained yet to do things they were trying to do, and perhaps, you know, got the hot pilot idea and overdid it.
And in fact, not long before I had arrived down there at Corpus Christi, one of the PBYs doing a night landing had hit one of the channel markers out there in the bay, and I think it killed about 8 or 9 people on that mission.
Some young cadets were also killed while evacuating the base during a hurricane.
The overcast was so heavy and the clouds were so heavy. But see, these kids didn't have the training that you don't fly through thunderheads in the type of planes we had then, and they'd get vertigo and lose their sense of upright flight, and the next thing you know, they'd be crashing.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to the base on April 21st, 1943, to meet with the President of Mexico.
Franklin Roosevelt was a dominating figure, both politically and everything. He was America. And when I saw them helping him out of the plane, and I realized he was paralyzed, what a shock. What a shock, you know, because you never seen him anywhere but sitting down or standing up, you know, in braces and like that. For me to realize that he was a polio victim, that was really a shock. But whereas it was a shock, it was also an inspiration.
After 1943, some of the pressure was off the base.
They didn't lose as many aviators in the Pacific as they expected to lose. And what they did, actually, they doubled the length of the training. I was a cadet for 18 months. And they started what was called the purge. And all the time I was a cadet, people were being washed out all around me.
Romances became more common during this time period.
We were not supposed to have anything to do with officers. That was the most broken rule, I think, in the waves, because they were nice looking too. They could dance.
We all went down to the Nueces Hotel, and we went to the Nueces, and that's where everybody met, and the young damsels around town knew we'd be down there.
There were sailors and cadets and waves all over town. I mean, they far outnumbered the civilians.
Many of the romantic relationships turned into marriages.
I have a very small social life. I married an attractive girl and have 5 children and been here now for 50 years.
Yeah, Faye and I met at the Officers Club on New Year's Eve, 1943. She had a date with a young Lieutenant JG, and I had a date with one of her friends. So when her date wandered off a little bit, and my date was off gabbing with someone else, we got out on the floor and danced. So that was how we met.
How many children do you have?
We have 5 children.
Many who came to Corpus Christi as cadets remained in Corpus as instructors. Often they grew a little bored with the routine.
We used to play tricks on each other. When we're coming in for a landing, we'd come real close and pull up, give them a little prop wash, and that plane would wiggle like that, and we'd go on about our business. And a few times we called it a little too close and lost that little knob on the tail of our plane, see? So we used to...
Well, I think also, you know, we talk about the baseball games. We had some tremendous baseball. We had Ted Williams' team came over from Bronson Field, and our team at Walden Field, we had Johnny Sane, who pitched for the Boston Braves, and Sam Chapman, who pitched for the Athletics.
Yeah.
He didn't pitch, he played
no,
outfield.
No, outfielder.
And we had some fine, fine baseball players.
Sooner or later, most of the cadets left Corpus Christi. In advanced training bases or in combat, they had to deal with rapid changes in air technology.
Yeah, every time the technology was improved or anything new came out, you had to retrain, had to be retrained. Now, sometimes this was OJT, on-the-job training.
Soon, some of the young officers faced combat. Ed Parker fought in Okinawa.
Because they had these hills, and the Japanese had burrowed into all these hills and had interconnecting things. But on some of the entrances, they had big steel doors. And at that time, we were not the only anti-aircraft was getting from small arms fire, so that didn't bother us. And there were no Japanese planes in the area, so we would come around and fly real low, and we used 5-inch solid steel-headed rockets, and we blow those doors down. And then after we blow the doors down, we come back around and do what we call skip bombing, where you fly real low along the ground and skip your bomb, 200-pound bomb, with a delayed action fuse up into that entrance, and then peel away, and then you'd look back and all of a sudden, pow, and there'd be smoke and Japs and all kinds of stuff coming out of these holes.
Phil Paribeau's luck ran out towards the end of the war. He was shot down in enemy waters and captured by the Japanese.
It was kind of mountainous there, and I had this broken ankle too that I hit the tail when I bailed out, so I was a cripple. So they had to end up carrying me across some of these small mountains finally to a highway, and there was a sedan waiting there with 2 Japanese enlisted men in the front seat and 2 officers in the rear seat, and they put me in the middle of the back seat. Took me into a town, small town, and they did give me wrap these burns a little bit, and gave me some water. Then they put me on a motorcycle sidecar and drove me through town and let everybody take a swing at me.
At about the same time that Phil Paribeau was shot down in Japan, Hein Bosowitz, a German prisoner of war, was brought to a POW camp which had been built at NAS Corpus Christi.
And now you became an artist while you were here in Corpus
That's
Christi.
right. I bought my first painting set here in Corpus Christi, and that's where I started to paint.
You had no interest in painting before then, or?
I was always interested in painting, but I never had the chance of getting a set.
Soon the war was over.
When the war was over, we had something like 300 airplanes out there. We put every one of them in the air to celebrate the VJ Day.
But one of our busiest days, of course, was when the war ended, VJ Day. We worked so hard that day. You didn't breathe, you had to work. It was just so steady. But everybody was so glad you didn't care.
and out at the gate, the buses were just full of people. They were hanging on the outside. Everybody who had a car had bodies hanging on the outside, and we all went to town. I don't think I'll ever forget that day.
Phil Paribeau was in a POW camp in Tokyo on VJ Day.
We're in the 11th Airborne Division balked in the front gate. They just walked in. A captain was in charge. He lined all the Japanese up. I inspected the camp with him, and we all left. He, on request, he gave me the permission to be to be the last person out.
Many of the aviators remained in Corpus Christi because they had married local girls. Others remained because they had found Corpus Christi a good place to live. The base was a major factor in the growth of the city. 50 years after the war, Hein Bosowitz returned to NAS Corpus Christi.
I'm very, very pleased to have come back here, like, you know, and have a look around. And I'm very, very pleased to be back here.
And you see things that you remember?
Oh, every bit of it.
Those times at NAS Corpus Christi are still clearly remembered by everyone.
At that time, we had national pride, you know. We loved our country. We wanted to do for our country what we could and get this thing over with.
I think that what is sad to people like myself who fought for 5 years for their country, and we fought to end wars. That was a war to end wars, and it didn't do the job. I mean, we've had lots of wars since. And sometimes I feel that a sense of failure that from my generation.
All these young people at marriageable age, you know, you can figure out what's going to happen. The people from Alabama are going to marry the people from Oregon and so on, and this is the way it was. And I think those changes probably will be a very long-ranging effect on the country, because maybe before then we were sort of isolated in our own worlds, speaking our own dialects and our own accents and so on.
World War II opened up my eyes into the world where it could be something else besides a young black. I could be a young American. I could live the American dream. That's what World War II meant.
I look back on the training at Corpus Christi. I think as they were some of the happiest days of my life. They were hard. They worked you hard, but as you look back on it, those were dear days. They were happy days.